Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Now we are going to start Korean National Diplomatic Academy session titled "The Art of the Pragmatic Diplomacy: Can Middle Power Partnership Serve as Korea's Strategic Alternative in a Turbulent World Order?" Before getting started, I would like to invite Mr. Myong, Senior Executive Director of Institute of Foreign Affairs and National Security at KNDA. Welcome to Mr. Kang.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. It is my pleasure to welcome you all. The Jeju Forum 2026 addresses a wide range of issues. Several sessions have particularly caught my attention, with themes such as geopolitical uncertainty, rethinking multilateralism, deglobalization, and chaos and disorder. As you may have noticed, these topics relate to current international order. Building on these discussions, this session raises an important question for Korean people. Can middle power partnerships serve as a strategic alternative for Korea in a turbulent world order? If Koreans answer this question by themselves, the discussion may become little more than self-reassurance. That is why it is important to hear the views of foreign scholars with diverse backgrounds and perspectives. I believe our distinguished panelists and moderator will help us better understand both the opportunities and challenges facing Korea's foreign policy. More important is that they can provide us with objective and nuanced insight into this important issue. Severe turmoil is unfolding across the globe. Let me give you examples. Strategic competition among two superpowers, economic coercion against allies as well as adversaries, fierce rivalry over advanced technology, and military invasions by major powers. In response, countries are seeking strategic flexibility while trying to preserve the benefits of open, rules-based international order. Middle powers in particular explore partnerships with countries that share core critical common interests. Some argue that these coalitions can strengthen the diplomatic influence of middle powers, improve supply chain resilience, promote technological cooperation, and reinforce international norms. Others, however, caution against excessive optimism because middle powers differ in geography, threat perceptions, economic interests, and domestic politics. In fact, Korea is not new to this type of diplomacy. Successive governments have pursued initiatives such as MICTA, a partnership among Mexico, Indonesia, Korea, Turkey, and Australia. And Korea has actively participated in regional forums such as ASEAN Plus 3. Through these efforts, Korea has sought to diversify its diplomatic fronts while complementing its alliance with the United States. What is different today is the external conditions under which middle power partnership is summoned, as well as the task it is expected to perform. This session asks whether middle power partnerships can provide Korea with greater strategic resilience in an era of disruption. What are Korea's most urgent interests to protect through strategic partnerships? Can partnerships effectively complement Korea's existing alliance? What conditions are necessary for such partnerships to succeed? And what are their practical limits? I hope today's panels will offer thoughtful answers to these questions and contribute to a deeper understanding of Korea's role in the turbulent world order. Now, I would like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Cho, who will moderate this session. Thank you once again for joining us. 감사합니다.
Thank you, Mr. Kang. Now I invite distinguished scholars and ex-speakers from many major countries, including the United States, Australia, Japan, and India, and our nation, Korea. First, next to me, Professor Amitav Acharya. He is distinguished professor and the UNESCO chair at the American University, Washington, D.C. He is the first non-Western scholar to be elected in 2014, the president of the International Studies Association, a flagship international relations academic intellectual platform in the United States. And then we have Professor Thomas Wilkins from Australia. He is associate professor in international security at the University of Sydney. He now serves as associate editor for the IR academic journals, such as International Relations of the Asia-Pacific and the Australian Journal of International Affairs. Third speaker is Professor KOGA. He is associate professor of the School of Social Sciences at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. He had just published this year a book titled Japan's Grand Strategy at Oxford University Press. And fourth guest speaker is Dr. Jagannath PANDA. He is head of the Stockholm Center for South Asian and Indo-Pacific Affairs at the Institute for Security and Development Policy in Sweden. And also he is a senior fellow at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies in Netherlands. Final speaker is Professor Jung Gu-yeon. She is Associate Professor of Political Science at the Gangwon National University. She served a policy advisor for several ministries and agencies of the government of ROK, and now she currently serves as a member of the Policy Advisory Committee of the Ministry of Defense and ROK Navy. So I would like to separate the session into two rounds. And first round is about middle power partnerships. So I will give 5 minutes to each speakers. So let's begin with the middle power partnerships. So, as you know, the Prime Minister of Canada, Michael Carney, raised some debatable issues regarding the revival of middle power partnerships. So middle power partnership debate is not new, but now is more in fashions. So since then, many commentators and experts emphasized the importance of middle power partnership amid the U.S. withdrawal of its global leadership and fragmented international order. So at the same time, recently the Professor Michael Beckley published his articles about the middle power delusion article in Foreign Affairs. So he emphasized that the middle power partnerships without United States is impossible because most of the U.S. allies and partners have been heavily dependent on U.S. capability and technology. In that sense, it is impossible for U.S. allies partners, especially middle powers, to create coalition. They need to make some alignment, not the coalition. So in that sense, I think we need to have discussions on that, the pro and cons regarding the middle power partnerships. So now I would like to invite Professor Acharya. You recently wrote about the world minus one at the moment. So in the era of the world minus one moment, what do you assess the middle power partnership plausibility, and do you think it works well, or there are any challenges and opportunity? So,
thank you. Thank you very much. My article, World Minus One, came out in Foreign Policy, which is a much less conservative magazine than Foreign Affairs. They were talking about Bickley and others. Foreign Affairs never really diverges from the US dominance, US dominated world order. There are other outlets, including Foreign Policy, which is actually much more kind of open and more tolerant of alternative views that look at alternative ways of conceptualizing middle powers and world order. World minus one simply means a moment where the United States has either deliberately or because of domestic constraints have withdrawn from the global stage or changed its policy towards a very anti-multilateral, anti-alliance posture. And how do you deal with that? Can you still have cooperation without the United States being an active or leader? And my view is yes. There have been many cases in the history that United States have been not only absent, but also opposed. And I can give you law of the sea is one of the examples. Still absent, but there are many other. The United States has actually in many ways been a reluctant leader. Many elements of the United Nations system, including human rights covenants, the United States was against it. So we still have cooperation because other powers can actually push it. And I'm arguing, and you're invited to read this article in Foreign Policy, the opening issue cover story of January 2026. Linked to that, let me just tell you what a middle power can do or not do depends on two things. One is the structure of the international system. What is the international or world order? What kind of distribution of power and ideas and leadership we have in the world? And that's not static. The second thing is the agency of the middle power itself. That agency depends on its own national capacity, but also what kind of international partnership it wants to forge. And that in turn depends on domestic politics, who is in power. The same middle power can have very different policies if the governments change. So, but let me focus on the first one, because I just published a book that looks at 5,000 years of history of world order, how world order came about. And the main finding, single most important finding, is that world order has never been the monopoly of one country. Or one civilization. Many of the ideas and institutions of world order we have today were actually created over multiple places through history. And the Western countries and the United States, only the last few hundred years have been dominant. But even the ideas of free trade, where the first great power cooperation came about? 15th century BC, between Egypt and four other great powers of the Middle East. They created a concert system well before the 19th century concert. So the international system is changing, and here you can see where I position middle powers. We have hegemony, we have multipolarity, and then we have what I call multiplexity, the last one. Now, in a hegemonic system, like the US hegemony, middle powers have very little room to maneuver, autonomy. In a multipolar system, also, middle powers have very little agency, because multipolarity is about great power. It's a great power club. If you go back to 19th century, it's the big powers that call the shots. So where is Indonesia? Where is South Korea? Where is Brazil? Where is South Africa? I mean, these countries have no role in there. But these countries do play a role, especially in their own regions. What about non-state actors? Like other good ones or bad ones, like terrorist groups. So multipolarity, which everybody is talking about, is a very narrow way of defining world order, and it kind of excludes middle powers almost by definition, as does hegemony. So Michael Bickley and others are probably talking about the hegemonic order, and the US, unless you're working through the US, you cannot do anything. But a lot of things in the world has been done without the United States. During the Cold War also, many ideas, norms, interactions, maybe great powers have material capacity, but world order is not just about material, military, economic capacity. It's about ideas, diplomacy, regional cooperation, and interactions. So I think middle powers have more room, in a multiplex system. The one other point is that multiplex is complex. We are very used to thinking about simple hegemony, one power, unipolarity, simple. Multipolarity, 5, 6 powers, simple. Multiplexity is very hard to conceptualize. And analysts, and whether you are working in the stock market or in the government, you just trying to avoid it. We call it fragmentation. The Jeju forum is called fragmentation. Fragmentation is not the right word. What we have is complexity. And sometimes, by the way, fragmentation can be creative. Joseph Schumpeter, an economist, talked about creative destruction. Fragmentation is creative destruction. I use the term creative diversification. This is the time when middle powers can actually come into their own. There are a lot of constraints. I'll talk about it in the next session. The constraints are there, but there is actually an opportunity depending on how we think about the world order, if you're thinking within the box or outside the box.
Thank you, Professor Acharya. Yeah, I'm sorry I cannot give you more time to talk. Now, Professor Thomas Wilkins, you are leading expert on the multilateralism in international relations. So usually the multilateralism is more focused on the U.S.-led multilateralism since usually the Trump 1.0 and then Biden administrations. But without United States engagement, without U.S. influence, the middle power multilateralism, how it works and how it is linked with the middle power partnership in this era.
Thank you very much, Moderator. So yes, I will come down from the lofty heights of the international system structure that we've just heard about, talk a little bit more about what the practical strategic options for middle power cooperation are. So, we tend to talk about regional security architecture, and traditionally speaking, middle powers have been very much proponents, builders, supporters of multilateral cooperation. Think of things like APEC and so forth in the past. But we now find ourselves in a different environment, an environment of strategic competition, where question marks over the efficacy of large multinational institutions are being raised in terms of their ability to mediate this turbulent environment. So I think middle powers themselves, who are, as Amitav pointed out, not without a certain degree of capability and agency themselves, they have several options in terms of how they join partnerships or other groupings outside of multilaterals. Effectively, what kind of tools of security cooperation or security alignment can they engage in? Well, typically speaking, many of the middle powers, but by no means all, if we count India as a middle power, are US treaty allies, and they have bilateral military treaty alliances with the United States. And then the second one that they've tended to adopt, which sort of seems to have gone under the radar a little bit, is forming non-alliance forms of security cooperation known as strategic partnerships. You hear this term strategic partnership everywhere. It can mean both everything and nothing. Not all strategic partnerships are alike. But it seems that middle power states, Australia, my own country, but Japan as well, is also a major proponent of using strategic partnerships. So are strategic competitors like China and Russia, for example, India as well, as a plethora of strategic partnerships. So these are other bilateral forms of non-alliance security cooperation where these middle powers can club together. Now, the third one is, as Mr. Cho mentioned, is minilateralism. And minilateralism obviously is going beyond the bilateral level to attach a third or fourth or fifth partner. You probably heard this term minilaterals being bandied around now, both within the scholarly realm, but also I think, in terms of policy usage, there's a lack of clarity about this. Myself and of course my good colleague KOGA KOGA have tried to probe into this issue as to what exactly minilateralism is about. So let me just try and give you something to get a handle on when it comes to the term minilateralism, which is a key policy mechanism that middle powers have begun to engage in. So we're basically looking at states, usually like-minded states, often US allies, but sometimes US partners as opposed to allies, in the case of India. 3 to perhaps a maximum of 6 states getting together in a small group. Anything bigger than 6 starts to get a bit unwieldy, starts to move towards the terrain of multilateralism. So we're basically talking about trilaterals or quadrilaterals or pentalaterals, which apparently is the word for 5 states. And we have 2 different types of minilateralism to my own mind. One is just these 3 or 4 states get together for something very issue specific. Could be security cooperation, could be economics, could be confidence building, something in a fairly sort of generic format where they just want to solve a problem and it's better to solve it together. Think something like the Malacca Straits Patrol, where they just did, they worked on counter-piracy cooperation. But they had no kind of commitment to a very sort of long-term and multi-dimensional relationship. But I would identify on the basis of Kay's terminology something known as strategic minilaterals, and these are typically where you see the middle powers alongside the United States, but not always, reside. And these are much more powerful combinations of states like the Quad, like AUKUS, like US, Japan, Australia, like US, Japan, Korea, and so forth. And these kind of strategically orientated minilaterals have the power to reshape the international order, or at least to influence it in terms of both kind of normative and material aspects, both things like the free and open Indo-Pacific, but also perhaps the military balance of power. So those are some of the instruments that you've got in the middle power toolkit, with minilaterals being the most important one, but strategic partnerships being something that we shouldn't overlook. And I'll try and place Korea's role in that in the second round of remarks more explicitly, having outlined that very specific terminology and those set of tools that middle powers have at their disposal. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wilkins. Professor Koi, you have recently written in Diplomat regarding the East Asians middle powers adaptation to waning U.S. power. So you said that over the last decade, East Asian middle power already have adapted to the decline United States, right? So how do you assess the ongoing middle power partnership, and also what are the challenging or what are the opportunities?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me this important the session. I'm glad to actually have the discussion with those kind of established people here. So I think the middle power cooperation is something that we have been kind of expecting after the post-Cold War era. And I think the one thing is that from the Japanese kind of point of view, always the U.S.-Japan alliance is the most important kind of the core the diplomatic and security policy tool that Japan can actually pursue in a way that Japan can pursue its own kind of national interest. But over time, as you see the situation in the strategic environment, the U.S. kind of influence is in the relative decline. So that you have to actually compensate with the decline by something that different kind of the coalition or the frameworks. And what Japan has been doing is Japan actually started to engage with some other kind of middle powers like the Australia or like the other Southeast Asian countries, so that they could actually form the certain kind of coalition where their kind of interest matches. And then they could actually push forward the rules and the norms that they could actually utilize to pursue their own national interest. So I think in that sense, the Japan also has Japan's actually see the United States as the most important ally, but at the same time, it's not going to be enough. It's not everything. So that you have to actually have something like the different from what it actually embedded in the previously. So that's where I think the middle power coalition comes in. The middle power coalition is actually something. First of all, like it has a really big limitation, right? Like first of all, it doesn't really have the strong material capabilities like China or the United States. And then second of all, if you see the middle powers kind of national interests, they are not always matched. Like they have like diverging interests, and then they are not always have the incentive to cooperate with each other. If you actually see the ASEAN, like you could actually see those kind of divergence as well. But then there are certain kind of convergence of interests where like you can actually pursue, and then you can push forward those kind of rules and norms, and then you could actually build the certain regional rules and norms where you can actually attract the other great powers from in the region too. So in that sense, I think like the middle power has still like the room to maneuver. And it's not everything. I don't think the middle power coalition can replace with the existing kind of alliances of the U.S. alliances in the East Asia and so on and so forth. But at the same time, again, like if you look at take a look at the kind of ASEAN's example, then like you can actually shape the perception of those kind of great powers, and also you could actually influence their behavior as well. And I think right now, because the U.S. and also China, for the U.S. kind of allies and partners, particularly United States, their kind of commitment and credibility is in the relative decline, right? Because their kind of foreign policy is not as consistent as it used to be, and then their allies and partners are not really sure where the United States is going, particularly these kind of like rules and norms. So in that sense, I think the middle powers kind of role is they could actually get together, and then if they're kind of common interests, and then the shared norms can communicated well, then they could coordinate creating the new kind of coalition to embed those kind of rules and norms in the region, particularly the East Asia and in the Indo-Pacific. So I think like this is how like you could actually practice the middle power coalition. And then just kind of one quick thing is that the Japan recently updated the concept of the free and open Indo-Pacific. And then usually people would consider that free and open Indo-Pacific or FOIP is the counter-China narrative or counter-China actions, but it's actually evolved over time. And then now, like the FOIP, the so-called updated FOIP, is focused more on the autonomy and also resilience in the region. And this is actually something that Japan is aiming at. I guess it's not again like replacing with the U.S. alliances, but then it's more like trying to create a new space for the middle powers to have the ability to shape the rules and norms in the region. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Professor KOGA. And now Dr. Panda, the India actually is not part of the U.S. alliance system, but still strongly aligned and connected with the United States through the quadrilateral security dialogue and other platforms. But the India is a little bit different from the other U.S. allies because it is pursuing the strategic autonomy. So how do you assess the middle power partnership discussions from Indian perspective?
Thank you, Dr. Cho, for this invitation. Also thanks to KNDA team, Director KANG and Ms. Lee for this kind invitation and hospitality. I think in India, if you ask anybody whether India is called as a middle power or not, nobody would agree. And probably that definitional confusion would continue to exist because in India, India is trying to portray itself in different formulations, sometimes as a major powers, sometimes as a promising great power or future great power in making, or sometimes as an emerging economy or emerging powers. So there are different computation attached to Indian foreign policy where they try to package it within multi-alignment. But I think that middle power configuration that we are talking about, very interesting in the context of India, because if you mentioned about Quad and you mentioned about India-US ties, but actually on practice, if you see, who are the countries that India really enjoys stronger partnership? That is actually with Japan, which is a middle power, and also now a progressive, stronger ties with South Korea, which is evolving from time to time. And with Australia, it is a safe, progressive, stable partnership we have got. So with these three middle powers, Australia, Japan, and South Korea, India enjoys the relative stability in its partnerships. And that actually addresses to your questions, that what really makes this diplomacy really works from India's point of view. As I mentioned, India might be hesitant to portray itself as a middle power, but the kind of foreign policy, the pragmatic diplomacy we bring, that actually fits into the account. Now, if we talk about the middle power partnerships, what really makes it really work? I would suggest that it's the challenges or the crises that middle powers face that makes their partnership to evolve. If we talk about Indo-Pacific, today my piece has come in the national interest, where I have talked about how the Indo as a word has been, deleted from the Indo-Pak command. There, if you see, the focus is that let's not give importance to Indo-Pacific anymore. So Indo-Pacific as a concept that we built over the last 10 years or so, a lot of credit to the former late Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, is now being pushed into the back burner. And that's the challenges and crises the middle powers really face. And therefore, it encourages the middle powers to think innovatively how to collaborate. Now, how to collaborate and how to look at the future, I think the challenges and the crises middle powers are facing, and relatively I'll include India there, I think it's a technological crisis. It's a challenges of security problems in the immediate neighborhood. In the context of India, it's China, Pakistan. In the context of South Korea, it's North Korea, and possibly to some extent China. And in the case of Japan, also China and North Korea. And that builds a commonality, and therefore a lot of credits to the current Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi. The kind of diplomacy and activism she is bringing to Japanese diplomacy, that is really going to be key for the progress and future of middle powers. The other point I would like to mention quickly is that what really promises this partnership to really flourish from here on. I think it's not the traditional alliance framework or kind of partnership we are trying to build. It's about the future partnership potential that we are, as a policy analyst, I could identify 4 or 5 areas where this middle power network could actually flourish and succeed. One is maritime choke points. The Strait of Hormuz really talked about that. Energy corridors, technological networks, and issue-based partnerships. And there, the success of middle power diplomacy really lies. If we talk about, Prime Minister Takaichi, she actually talking about defense modernization continuously, security upgradation, as Kei was mentioning about, the Japanese foreign policy upgradation. There are 3 concepts they have continuously revised. And that's actually critical not only to the future of Indo-Pacific, and also future of middle power diplomacy. And India is a beneficiary of that. So India would definitely echo the Japanese foreign policy evolution that is taking place, take advantage of the South Korean pragmatism that is being visible unprecedentedly, and probably promote to the extent of having a healthy and stronger ties between Japan and South Korea. If a stronger Japan and South Korea relationship is evolving, that is in the interest of India and in the interest of middle power networks that we are talking about. My last quick point is that I think what really going to shape the future of this partnership is that it's the maritime governance. I think all of the middle powers that we are talking about, particularly South Korea, Japan, Australia, and India, they have huge maritime interest. That really matters, that we should be really talking about innovatively how to push forward these middle power networks. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Panda. Lastly, Professor Jeong, you have a long looking into U.S. Security ties and relations with U.S. allies. How do you perceive, how do you assess the middle power partnership argument from your point of view, as you mostly focus on the U.S. security relationship with the U.S. allies?
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me in the first place. And also, Panda, I also agree with you in the sense that it should be some kind of cooperation framework in the maritime security. When it comes to South Korea's middle power diplomacy and their perspectives, I think we have to think about why do we have discussion in the first place. As Professor ACHARYA first mentions, we are kind of witnessing two different kind of trend. One is a U.S.-China competition. The other one is a much longer term kind of change, world -1. Which is related to multipolarity. It could be multiflex, as Acharya mentions. These two kind of countervailing or sometimes kind of reinforcing trend is making this middle power diplomacy a momentum. We have this discussion because of these two trends. And as long as we have these two trends, the middle power diplomacy discussion will prevail, I think. And that gives middle powers, or not even the rest of the world, have incentive to talk about the alternative to current great power relations, as well as alliance-based diplomacy, I think. So that's my kind of background about this, of thinking about this topic. So in that sense, I think middle power cooperation, even though South Korea has U.S. alliances, is pretty relevant. But at the same time, you have to acknowledge that there is a limitation as well. Not because of the kind of structural kind of constraint, but also because it is not easy, actually. It is not easy to create a coalition of middle power in the first place. I usually look at the international relations from the realist perspective. Maybe that's why. But given that there is a great power competitions, okay, we have middle powers, but how we can make a leverage against US-China competition as a middle power. Individual middle power does not have that much leverage against great power, but at the same time, if he has the size of middle powers, I think that's kind of great leverage, given that not only about the size, but also it gives kind of legitimacy about sustaining certain interests or certain morals. So if we have a grand coalition of middle powers, or unilateral or multilateral, whatever, then we can have some kind of thinking about incentives or kind of strategic kind of objectives in sustaining this middle power diplomacy. But as I said, we have a kind of limitations. Many other participants talk about many different aspects of limitations, but in my perspective, everyone mentions about we can, for instance, like PANDA mentions maritime security and choke point, as well as technological diplomacy. But my perspective is that those kind of issues kind of intertwining one another. In other words, we used to think about economic issue, security issue, or normative issue kind of separate manners. But now they are reinforcing and intertwining one another. And it is very difficult to have a kind of separate position and independent position beyond US-China competition. So that's kind of more constraint in delivering middle power diplomacy, I guess. So in case of South Korea, we used to think about, economy with China, security with United States, which is pretty a kind of traditional way of understanding of South Korea's diplomacy. But that position is no longer tenable. Because security and economy is going to intertwine one another. And typical example could be like AI. And another next one is kind of quantum technology as well. Those technologies not just about technology. It is about industry as well as military, as well as and the rural setting as well. And everyone is competing for those technology as a whole, not as a separate way. So in that sense, I think even though we have kind of middle power diplomacy in a specific kind of domains, it's very hard to sustain it, given that we have these two trends of great power competition as well as world -1 kind of mentality. So, so I will talk about later about South Korea's specific position about this middle power diplomacy. But I think that's kind of major reasons why we have very difficult times. Not only because we are allied with the United States, but also we have more structural reason to have a difficulty.
Thank you, Professor Chung. Given the discussions regarding middle power partnership plausibility, so there should be a potential and opportunity at the same time, limitations given that middle power partnership can make a sufficient the structural power, but still can cooperate in other issue areas. So the South Korea is now pursuing the pragmatic diplomacy by extending its diplomatic portfolio, diversifying its diplomatic relations with the developed countries, including G7, but also the global South countries. So in that sense, the middle power partnership also crucial and critical for South Korea's diplomatic and strategic diversifications. I would like to ask you the second round of discussions about the role of South Korea in its pursuing middle power partnership with other like-minded countries, not just from the global North, but also global South. The first, I would like to ask you, Professor Acharya, in your argument about the multiplex order. So within the multiplex order, what do you expect the role of the South Korea in the middle power partnerships?
Thank you. I wish I could explain to you in detail. I invite you to read the book. There is a Korean edition of this book just come out. And one thing that book will tell you, it's called Once and Future World Order, that historically, when we do history, we always focus on great powers. But historically, not so great powers have actually created more institutions and ideas than we actually know. Because our history is biased towards big powers, big empires. But there was, look at Korea. Korea historically has played a very important role, but not because of military power, but ideas, the spread of Buddhism. Korea was the mediator between China and Japan in spreading Buddhism, the single most important cultural factor in Asia, throughout Asia. So what I just found that my mindset have completely changed after doing research and writing for the book. I invite you to read the book, especially the Korean translation. But a multiplex is basically one element of multiplex. It expands the number of actors. It's not just one or two, like unipolar, bipolar, or multipolar. Multipolar is basically a handful of great powers. It's a combination of great powers, middle powers, regional powers, and do not forget non-state actors. Non-state actors like terrorist groups or transnational social movements, they actually play a very important role. So why would we, therefore, only focus on the great powers? Because historically, that's not the case. Just because that's the way the history has been actually narrated. Now, let me also tell you one thing about South Korea. There are a lot of things South Korea can do. I'm not a South Korea expert, but I want to emphasize that you have competition. The category of middle powers have expanded dramatically. During the Cold War, we only talked about Canada, Australia, Sweden, Norway, Scandinavian countries. It's a middle power. When you talk about middle power, there were like 5 or 6 that did all the action, like in WTO, in multilateral human security and responsibility to protect. But now middle power category has expanded. And there are 2 elements to this expansion. One is the majority of middle powers today are global South countries. So Indonesia, South Africa, Brazil, Egypt. So they are no longer the Western allied countries like South Korea. And recently you saw the 2 countries that played an important role in the Iran-US mediation. Pakistan, nobody recognizes Pakistan as a middle power. And the other one is Qatar, which is pretending to be middle power because it has the resources. So middle powers, South Korea has competition. Second thing that has changed is that they're more revisionist than reformist. The traditional middle powers like Canada and Australia never really try to change the international system. They're happy to be within the American alliance and the so-called liberal world order, which is a misnomer anyway. Now with the expanded membership and diversity has increased within the middle power category, and they are more revisionist. They want to really change, not revolutionary, but revisionist powers. And therefore, South Korea also has to deal with that because on the one hand, South Korea has the industrial capacity, even military capacity. It's one of the most powerful militarily in terms of defense production in Asia. But then you have to deal with countries which are actually not allied to the United States? And how do you carve the niche out of it? So I think some idea of what I call creative diversification. And it'll be unrealistic to say you can ditch the US alliance and do the middle power stuff the way some other countries, like Brazil, and Brazil is very anti-US now. South Africa is on the crosshairs of US sanctions. But at the same time, there can be some creative diversification of roles that doesn't fall within the traditional middle power category. And in some ways, you have to compete with other middle powers. The middle power category is internally competitive now. It's not collaborative. We have no real institution now that brings in all the middle powers. Brings in some of the middle powers. But within that, therefore, I have to think very creatively of cross-linkages with different kind of coalitions and not just be beholden to one category. And I still think regional cooperation is very important. Working within Southeast Asia, ASEAN, East Asian, reviving some sort of the East Asian community idea is not a bad idea. The time is actually good for it now.
Well, thank you, Professor Acharya. Professor Wilkins, the Australia is strengthening its own security cooperation with the United States through the AUKUS agreement. At the same time, it is diversifying its security relations with other like-minded countries, including the Philippines and Indonesia, by upgrading the defense agreement. At the same time, the Pacific Island Ocean, some countries. So in its diversifying its security relations and diplomatic relations, what do you see the value of the South Korea in Australian diversification? What is the value of South Korea in Australia's expanding middle power partnerships?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Cho. Yeah, let me get to that, but just first respond to Amitav's remarks. I think when Amitav was talking about middle power cooperation, thinking of this in a sort of a system level way, and it is possible to build middle power coalitions across regions, but I find it difficult to see many opportunities where you could find Brazil, South Africa, South Korea, Qatar and Australia or something, within the same kind of collective. So I would, again, perhaps reduce things down to the regional level, whereas maybe the richest opportunities are there for practical cooperation with countries like Australia, Korea, Japan, India, and so forth. To that point, I think, middle powers really need to engage in some introspection about what it means to be a middle power and how they're placed within the region, within my argument, and what middle power diplomacy actually looks like, and also perhaps be a bit more willing to support each other than they have been in the past. For example, coming back to Australia now, when Kevin Rudd very specifically said that he would practice middle power diplomacy around sort of 2008, 2009 to create this concept of an Indo-Pacific community. This ended up in failure because he got very little support from other middle powers. Now, that might have been partly because of how he diplomatically handled that initiative, but perhaps there's a need for a bit more solidarity between what I would call like-minded middle powers, which would include the ones I've just mentioned, Korea, Australia, Japan, India, and so forth, rather than just some hodgepodge of completely different countries that maybe only have very narrow bandwidth. So maybe we need to think about now in these times of crisis that we need to drive more solidarity, but also perhaps be a bit more creative in rethinking what it means to be a middle power. And certainly with all of its its capacity, its think tanks, its intellectual environment, there's certainly a major role for South Korea to play in rethinking and redefining what it means to be what we conventionally called a traditional middle power to what a traditional middle power looks like in the era of strategic competition of the 21st century. So I think there's a few things as to they relate to Korea and were refracted through the Australian lens. As you rightly said, Australia is really doubling down on its alliance with the United States, and I think that's just a fact of life for Korea. The US alliance is the bedrock. There's no going away from that, but the middle power space is sort of supplementing that and diversifying it a little bit, maybe to do some some different things like regional norm building, like the free and open Indo-Pacific is a great way of crystallizing cooperation. I mean, in that sense, countries like Australia and Korea and Japan and so forth can, in some ways, that's the order that we want in the Indo-Pacific region. Not an, U.S. hegemony has faded now, so we can't rely on that anymore, right? But we don't potentially want a region that is dominated or a hegemonic region, sort of where China calls the shots. So we're all in the same position there. We're all a little bit split, but we have to manage both of those two kind of superpower constituencies. So by a little more solidarity and stepping in to uphold our preferred vision of regional order, which is essentially the FOIP in its policy form, but the rules-based order or whatever we can agree upon, that creates some space. If we're all saying this and we all speak in unison over this, that can definitely shape the region, I think. And obviously South Korea can play a major role in that, whatever we might want to call it. I think another thing is to work hard to thicken the connections. It's very much a key thing to talk about, building coalitions and everything. But as the Beckley article says, sometimes these things can just be symbolic and there's not really anything practical behind them. In order to get to that level, we probably need to do more by knitting together a bilateral network of strategic partnerships and strengthening the relations between middle powers before we can have the ambition of all coming together on the same page. So I'll end with that point by just noting that I found out that Korea and India had upgraded their relationship to a special strategic partnership, which is exactly the step in in that direction that I'm pointing towards. So I'll leave it there and offer any other additional comments.
Okay, thank you, Professor Wilkins. And now the Professor Kwok Kei. Japan, Korea's neighbor countries. How do you see the comparative advantage or valuable leverage of Korea to expand the middle power partnership with like-minded countries from Japanese perspective?
Thank you very much. So I think Korea has the ability to introduce the new ideas like in the region a lot because if you actually look at their historical their kind of experiences that South Korea had like in the region. For example, like the South Korea actually created the idea of the ASPAC, like Asia Pacific Council in 1960s and 1970s. And that was South Korea's initiative to create an institution, even though it was actually collapsed in the end because that has the strong kind of the anti-communist kind of the tendency, so that like not many the members was actually the bandwagon on that kind of institution, but the South Korea tried. And also, if you actually look at the recent example, like 1999, then when the ASEAN Plus 3 was created, Kim Dae-jung actually launched the idea of creating the East Asian Vision Group, where like many of the scholars in the region come up, and then they tried to kind of produce some ideas for the community building, which actually resulted in the East Asian Summit. Even though the vision itself is not like materialized in a way that like they actually tried to promote, but I think like the South Korea had those kind of like the capability to produce the certain kind of ideas where the middle powers or like the regional powers can get together and then create the certain impact on the regional framework. So I think the South Korea has the institution, the building, the capabilities for that. And then also I think the South Korea always like wants to actually do something beyond this the Korean peninsula, and then this is a really good thing. And then I think that is the kind of the efforts from a Japanese perspective. I think like that's the kind of efforts to shape the regional rules and norms. And then South Korea is kind of trying to get involved in those regional frameworks, and then do something in order to kind of stabilize the regional security and then also economic stability. And but one thing I was kind of wondering is that from the Japanese perspective, you don't actually really have the clear kind of consistent foreign policy doctrine. And then what Japan is right now having is again like the free and open in the Pacific. Free and open in the Pacific is inconsistent. Even if you change the prime ministers, they're gonna actually stick to that. So they could understand what Japan is actually trying to do in the region. But in South Korea, like every time I know, like domestically, there's some kind of like the divides. But then every time the administration changes, then you actually change the terminology. And then like we kind of like think, oh, this is actually something like different from what the previous administration did. And I think like this actually cut back some of the diplomatic consistency in South Korea. So maybe like if you could actually have the bigger framework of the foreign policy doctrine, so for the progressives and the conservatives can utilize both. Then like I think that South Korea has the stronger the diplomatic capability to facilitate cooperation in the region. And I think like that's that. And then also so that's a kind of big framework. And the other thing is where we are going to focus on. I think South Korea has the comparative advantage in terms of the technology, and then also you have the technological capabilities and also the economic capabilities. And then by doing with this kind of like the technological capabilities, maybe like you could actually contribute how to create the rules and norms, not only like the region, but also like beyond the region. For example, right? So currently like we have two types of not like two types of the norms, and also the not norms, but then one is the existing one, right? Like we have the kind of norms of the liberal norms, like the democratic and so on and so forth. Or like what about non-interference, the UN Charter kind of stipulated these kind of norms. And the other one is something that like we don't really have. So that AI, we don't have rules and norms. And also the other kind of the technological field, which we don't actually still debating about the creation of the rules and norms. And this is actually where like you could actually come in and then shape the rules and norms. For example, again, like Japan has took the initiative to create the ASEAN-Japan AI co-creation initiative. That is something that we should take into account the cultural context of the AI usage, because currently like AI is embedded in the Western kind of like values. So that like we have to kind of incorporate our kind of other like the non-Western values into the AI as well. And I think like this is something that the South Korea can also contribute to shaping the regional rules and norms. So I think like in that sense, South Korea has a capability, but then I think like how you gonna approach it is something like that, like you may need to actually think about too. So that's from the Japanese perspective. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now Dr. Panda, as you know, the President Lee Jae-myung paid a visit to New Delhi in 8 years. So since then, the South Korea and India promised to upgrade its partnership to the next high level. So in that sense, what does South Korea mean to India in its diversifying relationship in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, South Korea means a lot to India. I think, as I mentioned earlier in my speech, that I think if one relationship which is improving and progressing massively, that is India-South Korea partnerships. After India-Japan. India-Japan partnership has been the frontline partnerships for Indian foreign policy, but then India-South Korea partnership is also moving forward quite fast. But I think the way the partnership has been strengthened through comprehensive strategic partnership, there is a lot to do bilaterally. But I think if we try to only envision India-South Korea partnership bilaterally, that would be a real shortcoming. We need to move forward to a regional space or to a global space, and this is the right time when we are talking about middle powers should take the frontline seat to talk about few things. And therefore, there are 5 or 6 areas or different aspects where India, Korea could collaborate along with the other middle powers, particularly with Japan and Australia. Now, one of the point, my first point here would be that, how to take advantage of this struggling rules-based order. We know that rules-based order is either it's dead or it's real in danger or struggling currently. But I think in that, if we see the trajectory of last 50, 60 years, each one of these middle powers, particularly South Korea, Japan, they have got advantage. India has got advantage, but they have not really been able to take a frontline seat as a leader. So I think backing the revival of the rules-based order, protecting the interest in Indo-Pacific and protecting the narrative of Indo-Pacific is critical. And therefore, we need to really back that critical idea that Shinzo Abe talked about earlier and Prime Minister Takaichi currently talking about, the free and open Indo-Pacific. That needs to be strengthened. And there, the partaking of South Korea with each of these powers, including with India, is critical. And therefore, when we are talking about G4 as a group to reform the UN system, it's not really going to work out without South Korea. South Korea needs to be, brought into it as a G5 or under some different composition. And we need to really talk about UN reforms there. The other point is that here, when we're talking about middle power configuration, we are talking about a non-hierarchical partnership. If we talk about the earlier partnership, it was much more hierarchical alliance framework where there is a Western dominance. The safety and security of South Korea and Japan is heavily reliant on the alliance exercises with the United States. But here, be it with South Korea or under the middle power partnership, we are talking about a non-hierarchical partnerships in areas which are promising areas. Quality infrastructure, what actually the Japanese foreign policy is continuously stressing about. And also South Korean foreign policy is stressing about quality infrastructure, diplomacy, climate cooperations, green technologies, then solar alliance program where India is taking the leadership. There, a concrete level of collaboration is possible. The other is that, as I mentioned, the narrative. The protection of narrative is critical because, as I wrote in my piece today in the national interest, the Indo-Pacific is under threat. Each of these countries need to really talk about the protection of Indo-Pacific minus US, if that is possible. So therefore, the narrative needs to be protected. And then, if we talk about each of this power, they act upon a pressure zone. In the context of Japan and South Korea, it's almost they are working on a similar pressure zone. And here the pressure zone is coming not for anything. It is coming from that trilateral alliance which is making China, Russia, and North Korea. And also the key moot point here is the nuclear pressure. So I think what we have to talk about is a beyond pressure zone collaboration among the middle powers. The other two short points is that I think this is where South Korea could be a real partner for India and also with Australia and the progressive pragmatic policy that is happening between Prime Minister Takaichi and President Lee currently is we need a real-time supply chain network collaborations where we could protect and revitalize the regional economy. And in the interest of time, I won't really go into the details, but then I would just make a last point is that we are entering into a very strange world. And this world is governed by technology. So it's a digital world we are already living in. And there are different kind of threats, cyber threat, nuclear threat, and many other. But disruptive technology, how to manage disruptive technology could be one of the medium of collaboration. And there, the leadership of both South Korea and Japan is critical. And therefore, I would like to see a progressive, stable South Korea-Japan relationship, which is critical to the future of middle power diplomacy, as well as a good partnership with India.
Thank you, Dr. Panda. Finally, Professor Jung, you mentioned that the middle power partnership can not afford to replace United States leadership and power. Instead, might supplement the U.S. Leadership decline. So, from your perspective, what should South Korea pursue and do in the middle power partnerships?
Well, I think middle power diplomacy, as I mentioned in the previous comments, I'm not saying that we cannot kind of replace, but there is a kind of strong kind of anchored kind of relationship with the U.S. and South Korea. So we have the structural kind of constraint in that sense. And the reason why we have structural constraint is that not only about U.S.-China competition, but because we have North Korea. So in that sense, we have a constraint. So if we want to pursue middle power diplomacy, I think we have to think about like three things. First, South Korea needs to understand that the rise of the multiplex world orders does not equal to the decline of rule-based orders in the first place, because that gives room for middle power countries to gather together in the first place. As Panda mentions, we have a lot to work on to rulemaking process in many different domains. And the second one is that, especially in the context of South Korea's diplomacy, we do not use this middle power diplomacy as a replacement for the equidistance diplomacy toward US and China. Because as KOGA mentions, there's a very much polarization when it comes to South Korea foreign policy. And even regarding the middle power foreign policy, there's very different opinions about it. So in that sense, we have to make sure that it is not replacement for the kind of equidistance policy, but it's kind of third way we have to diversify our foreign policy as well as diplomacy as well. So against that, the third one is that how much we can step up in the first place. And this is kind of perennial questions in South Korea's foreign policy and South Korea diplomacy. We talk about it all the time, and related to the North Korea issue, there is a constraint when it comes to diplomatic assets, military assets, economic assets. Most of our assets are more focused on North Korea. Even though we have different level of North Korea threats, most of our concentration and focus is in North Korea. So in that sense, how much we can step up? That's another question we have to think about. But still, we have capability, and how we can navigate that capability into a tangible foreign policy outcome. We need longer discussions. First, I'll talk about this strong capability that South Korea has. As Panda and many other participants mentions, we have strong capability in semiconductor, shipbuilding, defense industry, digital infrastructure, as well as green technology. And we can translate that into two different ways when it comes to revitalizing our middle power diplomacy. First aspect is how we can contribute the public goods in the turbulent orders. We can translate our capability into a public good. For instance, like as you mentioned, supply chain. We can coordinate supply chain institutions as well as rulemaking as well. And critical mineral partnership. This has been very important issue since the U.S.-China competitions, and everyone is vulnerable to this critical mineral shortages. And AI and digital industries as well. As KOGA and Panda mentions, we have very competing models, competing a large language model, and now we have like physical AI models between US and China, but rest of the world are pretty vulnerable. We don't have any technology, and we don't have any rules and kind of even practices, how we can navigate this development. And Of course, as a South Korean, we have to emphasize the maritime capacity buildings. And you mentioned about maritime domain awareness. My recent interest is about undersea domain awareness as well, given that we have Yellow Sea right next to China. So we have to think about how we can coordinate this maritime capacity building, not only for South Korea's strategic interests, but also for the Indo-Pacific as well, as a whole. And also, we can coordinate our capability into the recent wars, Ukraine as well as Middle East. We can rebuild those places. And of course, more important thing is that how we can gather together for the infrastructure or resilience for the Global South. As we are observing this multiplex orders, I think it's very important to share our capability with Global South as well. So all of these are already on the table. I think, as I mentioned, how much you can step up in the first place. That's kind of that depends on that questions. I think our middle power diplomacy can be very, very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Jung, and thank you for all speakers. We have exactly 10 minutes left, and I would like to open the floor to receive the questions to speakers. When you ask a question, please identify yourself with your affiliations. Any questions and comment? Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Patrick Ponston. I'm with the Open Society Foundations. Thanks, everyone, for your really interesting comments. I think just reflecting from a European perspective, I think the reason that the whole middle powers debate has really kind of gained steam is because we've realized that the Americans won't necessarily be there for us. Excuse me. Won't necessarily be there for us in the event of a Russian invasion into Poland or Latvia or somewhere like that. Has that realization not happened in this continent? In your discussions with the Ministry of Defense, for instance, Professor Chung, is there still a belief that the Americans will be there for you when it really matters?
Well, I'm very pessimistic. Actually, yeah, I'm pessimistic in both continents, actually. I visited London 2 months ago to talk about deterrence conference, actually. And they don't have any hope or kind of expectations that the United States will be there. And in the Indo-Pacific theaters, we don't have that much expectation as well. And when you talk, of course, there might be kind of differences between working level at the elite level. They are sending very different signal. But when you're looking at the kind of decision makers' rhetoric and their policies and signals, most recent signal would be kind of Pacific comments, not Indo-Pacific comments. And also South Korea's pursuit of strategic autonomy is more likely sounds like United States kind of decreasing their commitment as well. So in that sense, we are expecting, even in the kind of Western Pacific, we don't expect that much commitments will be fulfilled in the future if something happens in these theaters. So that gives another reason for the middle powers to kind of coordinate or kind of start the discussions about how we can maintain these regional orders. But as I mentioned, some of the panelists mentioned that we have very different threat perception and different capabilities in the first place. So I think this could be a kind of good kind of starting place. We talk about strategic kind of dialogue, not just kind of economy or technology, but we have to think about like strategic dialogue when it comes to how we perceive this kind of hotspots and flash points in the region as well.
So it's time to have a creativity to coordinate among like-minded countries.
Could I just say something about that from the Australian perspective? Not so much about the guessing game as to whether or not the Americans will be there or not. I think we're going through a sort of extended inflection period where we realized things are changing and we got such incredibly heavy reliance upon the United States for security and for military hardware and so forth. On the one hand, we're trying to more deeply integrate with them to keep them engaged and to profit from it as much as we possibly can. On the other hand, we've also had a similar recognition to the Europeans, which is, just in case, we better start creating, I wouldn't call it a plan B, but I call it a supplementary plan to increase self-reliance, to build up our own military-industrial complex with the help of the Americans, but also with the British, and major weapons platforms procured from alternative partners now, the British, the Japanese, Korea as well, and also a bit of a diversification in terms of our sort of hard security cooperation. I mean, the Japan-Australia strategic partnership is often referred to as almost an alliance now, given how much we're doing that. And then the UK is cooperating with Japan, we're cooperating with the UK. So we're starting to see some, some crystallization of plan B type things or supplements to like, let's just say we're moving some of the eggs out of the US basket and putting one or two elsewhere in a way that perhaps we didn't in the past.
Okay, and
Right. Thank you. So just quickly, relating to how the credible Japanese see the United States U.S. extended deterrence. I don't think the Japan is as pessimistic as Korea probably, but then they feel more kind of uncertain about what kind of commitment the United States is going to sustain, because now if you ask all the kind of security communities in Japan about the U.S. The commitment or plan A or plan B. Nobody actually talks about plan B before. But now they are actually started discussing the plan B. I mean, even though how unrealistic it would be right now, but then they are actually kind of thinking about what kind of options we have. And then I think partly it's not again like a replacement, but then they are actually talking about kind of more more kind of like-minded kind of coalitions. With the regional powers, including Australia, South Korea, India, and so on and so forth. So I think in that sense, Japan is more like in between right now. And then they are actually hoping that the United States is coming back, but then there's a more kind of uncertainties that we are going to face. So then how we could actually fill those kind of gaps in the future. So that's kind of discussion we have.
Very quickly, I think that question is really interesting in the sense because I'm based there in Stockholm, and I do feel this Russia pull and dynamics and Russia's security complexity in the Baltic region. So if you see last 5-6 years, two kind of problems has region. One is a kind of traditional problem, which is a war-centric problem, Russia-Ukraine, then we have a Middle East war. The other one is the non-traditional, which is pandemic. The way we do. And in both these problems, the response has been slow and response has been after the crisis has happened. So what we need, and I think your point is quite valid there, what we need is a preventive diplomacy, a kind of anticipated response before the crisis. And this is where I think given the complexity of North Korea, the Korean dynamics in Northeast Asia, given the problem of China threat, that Japan is facing, India is facing, the ASEAN countries in South China Sea are facing. We need a middle power preventive diplomacy, which needs to be institutionalized, which needs to have under some mechanism, even though institutions might take some time to be built or a network might take some, but we need a little bit of a mechanism. Bureaucratic mechanism, preventive diplomatic mechanism is needed, and therefore the role of South Korea would be critical in that context.
Thank you. We have almost time. Maybe final questions if you have. Very quick questions I can accept. No questions? Okay, and
I can say
yeah, so you have a final comment? Yeah.
South Korea is I think I see if there is a consensus in this group, it's that regional dimension is very important. Most middle powers are regional powers, most. So Canada and Australia might have been different during the Cold War, but in Australian diplomacy, it's a lot in the region, Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific. And Canada is, at one point, Canada doesn't have a region of its own. I mean, North America at one point was part of NAFTA, and that's gone. So recognize that the region is the base for middle powers. And that's where South Korea does have a very important role. But you cannot have a situation and one government comes and says, we're going to focus on East Asian community, like Mr. Hatoyama was there yesterday, and I have met him a couple of times. And that's the same time as Kevin Rudd proposed the Asia-Pacific community versus East Asia community. But both of them are good ideas. And the East Asian community led to actually the East Asian, in some way, summit. Not exactly the same way, but the idea, the East Asia Vision Group, East Asia Study Group. But what happened to this? Government changes, and then same thing in Japan. Government changes, and we're not in the region, we're outside of the region. You have to realize that this sort of regional cooperation is in the national interest, not a regime interest of a particular government at a particular time. How you propose it, I have seen this more in relation to Japan. When the government changes, the whole thing changes. I mean, Asia comes first, Asia comes last, and so you cannot have that. So in Korea, there has to be a strong domestic consensus discussion about what is in Korea's interest, South Korea's interest, irrespective of who is in power, because it matters. And Korea, South Korea, ASPAC is a good example. I remember my earlier book about Asian regionalism. ASPAC was very important, but it failed because it was just about the same time as ASEAN. ASEAN succeeded, ASPAC failed. You know why? Because ASPAC was anti-communist, as you say. ASEAN actually came on the back of the coffin of SEATO. It basically became more of a regional ownership. And ASPAC was seen as an anti-communist group. But they came about the same time, almost the same year. So I think it's very important for South Korea to have a domestic consensus. And this is what I'm saying, there are two ways the middle powers can act. One is the international structure, the other one is your agency. But your agency depends on domestic politics. And if you cannot have a domestic, and we see the world order is collapsing partly because the American domestic politics changed, not because everybody else changed. America itself changed the domestic politics. So maybe we should have more discussion on this in your think tanks. Well, how to develop a domestic constituency for regional cooperation, no matter who the government is.
Thank you, Professor Acharya, for your last comment. Okay, time's over, and I will wrap up the KNDA sessions. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much, distinguished our speakers. Thank you.